Yes, can you see my screen now?
Yes, awesome.
All right. Well, thank you, Lee, and I want to thank the Native Plant Society for asking me to speak tonight. It's quite an honor. Before I was waiting in the waiting room to get started, I saw there was 75 participants, and I'd like to believe that was because I'm so popular, but I have more of a feeling that it has to do with everyone being locked at home and kind of going stir crazy. But I am honored and thank you. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Jake Aalfs, and I'm a landscape architect at the San Antonio River Authority. I'm part of the sustainable infrastructure team there. And as most of you probably know, the River Authority's mission is to make the river safe, clean, and enjoyable. And as part of my job to fulfill that mission, I work a lot on stormwater and making sure the river's clean. Part of that is plants. And so my interest in plants really comes from the variety of plants available in San Antonio or Texas and how each of them fits into the landscape, what they contribute, what they do. And as part of that interest, I've kind of used native plants all around my yard. And I started off, this house is about, I don't know, 14 years old or so. I purchased it in 2006 and started off with just kind of talking to the builder, and they said they'll put in a sustainable landscape. And basically that consisted of a Texas sage or two and some grass in the front yard. Basically the backyard was bare and it was native plants to begin with. And I left it that way. However, I purchased the house in 2006 and wasn't able to move into it until 2014. So for those 8 years, I rented the house out and had a variety of renters in, and most of them took care of the yard by basically weed whacking it down to bare earth. So when I moved in, I slowly stopped doing that and eventually put a fence up around 2016 or so. And since then, I've been buying native plants and working with the native plants that are already here. And so after that fence went up and the deer pressure was taken off the backyard, I have a lot of great stuff in the backyard. And then I take a lot of time to try to plant stuff in the front yard that deer will stay away from. So let's go ahead and get started. Right now we're looking at a plant, this 10-petal thimbleweed that I found in the backyard just this spring. And I think I hadn't seen it before. And I think it really is due to the large amount of rain we got this spring. But I think it's a beautiful small little flower. And I hope to see it more and more in my yard as the years go by. So starting off in the front yard, right now I'm highlighting this plant on the left, Red Yucca. And this is a plant that I planted in the front yard in 2006, intending to move into the house, but never moving in. When I planted it, it was just a 1-gallon plant. And it's about 3 foot from the driveway, which is off to the left. So right now, it is almost 5 feet in diameter. It is gigantic. I have to trim the side right next to the driveway. However, I think it's such a successful plant and such an anchor for my front yard. You can see the bloom in red, and that's almost nothing. That's usually they're extending out, 8 feet or so. And I don't trim them except when they're very dried out. I think it's a great plant to have in your yard. I've noticed that it's very drought tolerant, one of the most bulletproof plants here in San Antonio. And it looks great next to our next plant, the mealy blue sage. This is the plant that's right in front of the red yucca. And as you can see, it's got beautiful blue flowers. Very nice green foliage. This plant is also one of my favorite plants. It readily reseeds each year, dies back in the winter usually, unless it's a very mild winter. I started off with just 3 of these plants in this area, and they have reseeded and spread all over the place. This year, with so much rain in the spring, I have a whole bunch of seed heads on right now, which I plan on taking off and taking into the backyard and distributing around. And that's really one of my main philosophies is buy 1, 2, 3 plants, try to fit them into your landscape, let them get established, which may take 3 years before they really get established and start to reseed and start to grow. But at that point, the seeds spread all over your yard and you end up not having to do anything. The plants, I try to establish planting areas, but I'm not really strict about what is planted in there. So if something pops up and it works, I kind of let it go until it fails. I do not have an irrigation system on my yard, front or backyard, but I do hand water as needed. So this area in the front yard is super successful underneath this mealy blue sage. You can see down here, there's a little bit of Weberville sedge popping up, and over to the side, hard to see, is some woolly stomodia. Also in my front yard, I planted an anacacia orchid tree. And it's a super successful tree in my front yard. I did remove an area of turf and put in some limestone gravel. And then it was basically bare for a while and I'm slowly replanting it. But this small tree I planted right in the front of my yard to kind of provide some interest in my front walkway. When I planted it, it was about 3 foot high, and right now it's about 6 foot high. It is super successful. I hand water it only, and it doesn't need irrigation very often. It's got very showy, nice white flowers in the spring, and it readily reseeds. And this is one of the best parts about this plant. I didn't know before, but towards the fall, late fall and winter, the seed pods form and turn dark brown. And I saw a lot of them on the tree, and I thought, oh, that's great. I'll gather some up and take them into the backyard. Well, I was out there hand watering, and I started hearing this cracking sound. And I noticed what's happening is when you water this tree or it rains, the seed pods explode and spread seed all over the place. So I do have little seedlings all over my yard, and I am a little bit behind in bringing those in to some of my coworkers. Sorry about that. Our next plant is Blackfoot daisy. And I have this plant in my parkway, that small area between the road and the sidewalk. In my parkway, I took all the turf out and just put some gravel in. I really also believe in low maintenance and low irrigation. So as part of that area, I planted some Blackfoot daisy, and this plant is perfect for that area. That area is often neglected and doesn't receive irrigation, even if you hand water, because it's kind of away from most things. But this plant thrives on neglect. In fact, this plant does better if you just ignore it. These white and yellow flowers are available at my house almost year round. The only water it receives is from a little bit of hand watering and from rain. And this plant does perfect. I will say that it is a little bit touchy. It does not like any kind of fertilizer, and that includes urine from my neighbor's dog. That is the only thing that does any damage to this plant. I like to say just plant this one and forget it. Next in my front yard, I have cedar sage. And I started off with my front yard having some large oak trees and basically a planted area underneath it, but that area was bare except for a couple Texas sages that the builder put in. And after I moved in, I did notice I had a couple Salvia greggii or autumn sage in there, and those are still in there. But I wanted something to fill in and act as a ground cover in that area. And as most of you probably know, finding a plant that grows in the shade is a little bit tough here. So I did a little bit of research and I came up with this cedar sage. It normally grows in the shade under cedars. I put it in here and I used a little cedar mulch to kind of get it settled in. And I probably planted 3 plants or so. And now all the area between the other plants and that planted area are filled in with this cedar sage. It reseeds readily. It does die back in the winter. However, those seeds pop up almost immediately. And throughout the whole spring, summer, and fall, you have the green foliage. You usually only get the flowers right after it rains. But I would say that this is a super successful plant and should be used more, even under oak trees. Works very well. So this plant, I'm not highlighting any one particular, this slide, excuse me, I'm not highlighting any particular plant, but this is that area in my front yard where I just have a bunch of plants that have grown together. So I have the cedar sage in here. I can see some lyre-leaf sage. In the background, there's some autumn sage. I do have this grass in the foreground or middle of the screen, and I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I did buy it at one of the native plant sales, and I'm working on identifying it. In the back, I believe there's some Turk's cap, and then there's even a vine in here. This is kind of what I like to see in my front yard, and you can also see the oak leaves that have fallen down, creating kind of like a self-mulch. And basically, I never have to go through this area and weed. The whole area is covered by native plants and or mulch, and it's very low maintenance. I do have to go through every once in a while and trim out some of the autumn sage and clean out the woodiness. However, other than that, I really don't have to do very much. And I look at that as a super success. The soil under this mulch and plants stays wet for 3 or 4 weeks after a good rain. So this is what I want in my yard, and I think is super successful, less work for me, and very little irrigation. So here's another little picture of that front parkway, and you can see the plant here, the Gulf Muley that I'm highlighting. Now this is right next to my driveway, and these two specimens do great here. I did have a third specimen between them, and they were all 1 gallons when they were planted. However, they were a little too close together, so I just transplanted that down to the end of this parkway area. These two plants are doing great. Right now, they don't look so great, a little bit dry, but the green foliage after a rain really spices up, and in bloom, these are beautiful. I'm sure most of you have seen the airy pink flowers. And I think these are just a good structural plant to put in areas. They stand up straight, very attractive, very successful, and drought tolerant also. Of course, they do like a little bit of water, and that's one of the things I've noticed. There's a lot of plants that are drought tolerant. However, they benefit from just a little bit of water once a week or so. This is also the area of my yard that I removed the turf. You can also see the Anacacha orchid tree here in the back, and if you'll notice, all the small seedlings underneath it, and maybe in some of the other slides, you'll even see some of the seedlings jumping across over here or other parts of the yard. Oh, this plant also readily reseeds, and I have many more volunteers in the front yard, some of them not in great places, but I'll let them grow a little bit until they get too close to being too big and then remove them. And the ones that are in good locations, I'll just let them continue to grow. Our next plant that I want to look at is inland sea oats. And this view is kind of my front yard looking back towards the driveway under those oak trees. So in the background, you can see some autumn sage, you can see some Turk's cap, and on the ground, you can see the cedar sage. But in this area, I decided I'm going to go ahead and plant some inland sea oats because I know they readily reseed. And you can see the little seedlings in the foreground spreading around. Has great look most of the year, has this nice green color with the seed heads on it. And then in the fall and winter, turns to a brown color. At that point, you can wait a while and trim it back down to the ground and it'll come right back. So far though, I've just let them go through the winter and then maybe pull off some of the real dry stalks when it comes to the spring. But I look forward to this one spreading around a little bit more, providing a little more ground cover in this area. I'm still not getting the cedar sage creeping down this hill very fast. But you can see a couple of them down here. That might be cedar sage or lyre-leaf sage creeping down here. Another one of my favorite plants, and this is not a great picture, but it's the Weberville sedge in this planted low area to the right of the walkway. And I really like this plant. I started off with just 3 specimens in here, and they have reseeded to fill in this area and spread all over the front of my yard. You can see some over here on the left side of the walkway, behind the words over here. And I take a lot of time once they start to seed out, going through and collecting the seeds, and I've distributed them in my backyard also. One of the best parts of this is you get so many seeds after a good rainy spring like we just had. This plant is low to the ground, it's evergreen, very drought tolerant. Of course it does appreciate some water every once in a while. And after a couple good rains, it really bushes out and looks very healthy. A perfect ground cover, and a good ground cover for full sun that you don't need to irrigate a lot. I like to highlight this picture also. At one of the native plant sales, I bought a 1-gallon container of buffalo grass, and I planted it underneath, I think it's a white sage, this plant here, which I don't think is a native plant, but I planted it under there. I wanted to see if I could get it to kind of just sprout and take off, and it is slowly taking off in this front yard. And right here you can see one of the stolons creeping along, and every so often, growing up a little sprout. It is definitely a slow grower. However, I'm hoping to get it to sprout more in this planted area and see how it competes. Over here we have some stomodia, and I think there's probably some horse herb, but I want to see how it competes in there and just kind of build more diversity in the area. You can see I have some mulch in there, so this area doesn't have a lot of ground cover, and I'd like to get it covered up. Also, it's good to point out here, you can see one of the Gulf muleys here in the foreground. And it's not a great location. I'll probably end up pulling it out. But until that time, it's providing a nice ground cover, and it looks great, better than just the regular mulch all by itself. So these are the kind of experiments that I like to do, get things going in the front yard, see what works, see what doesn't. Don't have to spend a lot of money, just buy a couple of them, and then I would like to eventually establish a plot of turf and possibly use this to get it started and have the whole plot be buffalo grass. It is very drought tolerant, and from everything that I've read, it needs full sun. But this example here is mostly under another bush, and it's doing very well with very little irrigation. Moving a little bit into the backyard, I wanted to point out my dog got into this picture, so he gets a little credit here. But this is looking into the backyard, and remember, this backyard was mowed and weed whacked to bare earth for about 8 years, and only beginning in about 2014 did I come in and stop mowing so much and weed whacking. This point right here where the oaks start, that is kind of like a lawn, mostly horse herb, and I do mow it. Beyond that, all the way to the fence though, I'm just trying to establish as a prairie. So this area is up outside of 1604, North San Antonio, and the soils are not very great. I have to say, most of the soil on my house is probably only a foot deep, and under that is limestone bedrock. These oaks are growing in a portion of the bedrock that is kind of chopped up, and they've broken through some of the rocks. But as you get down to this, right past the oaks, all of the area down there to the fence is only about 6 inches of soil above solid limestone bedrock. I did build a small berm along this edge right past the oaks because this kind of slopes down to the fence line, and stormwater comes off my house, and it collects down here, and I wanted to kind of collect it and let it infiltrate into the ground. And one thing I have learned, this area where the oaks are, where the bedrock is, however it's broken up by the roots of the trees, it infiltrates a great deal of water. Over the last couple of weeks, we've set up a small blow-up pool in this area to the right where the dog is for my son. And at the end of the weekend, I end up draining it. So that's, 80, 100 gallons of water. And that water only goes down about 3 feet into this planted area before it all infiltrates into the ground. So I'm really shocked to see how much infiltration I get there. And I think it's completely due to these oaks. So I definitely prize the oaks. I didn't even highlight them in this presentation, but they are part of why the yard's a success. My long-term goals are to turn that back area into kind of a prairie, and then to develop maybe a shed or some kind of covering out there, and possibly in the middle establish a turf area with that buffalo grass. So looking straight ahead, we're looking at a crepe myrtle that I planted in 2006, and it's doing okay, not so great. Like I said, the soil is kind of shallow. But I'm happy that it's there. I know it's not native, but it does provide a little bit of screening to my neighbor. So here's another picture looking at that prairie land in the backyard. And I was fortunate enough when the house was built, we talked the builder into dragging some boulders out there. And so I eventually want to use those boulders for a seating area, possibly some kind of a water feature. I'm not exactly sure yet. But as you can see, right now, there's bee balm growing, Indian blanket, way back along the back fence line. There's some twist-leaf yucca and a weesatch right in the middle. Now, I don't plan on keeping that, but for the time being, I'm letting it grow and letting everything kind of just figure out where it's going to go. I want to bring up right now the one issue I have with this yard. I have been pulling Torlis or hedge parsley out of this yard forever. For the last 3 years, every spring I start going out lunchtime or on weekends or in the evening, and I'll spend an hour. Or what I did this year is though I started counting, and I would pull 500 plants at a time. And this year, I think I spent 20 days pulling 500 plants each day. For all of you who don't have a calculator, that's 10,000 plants. That plant is one of the most invasive and annoying plants around. I do have it later in the presentation so you can see a picture of it. I just want to highlight, though, I've been working for 3 years to eradicate it from my yard, but the seeds are still there, and each year a couple, 10,000 more germinate. I think eventually, though, I got all of them out of the yard this year before they were able to seed. So this is my most successful year ever. Maybe it has to do with staying home a little bit more and having a little freer lunchtime. But that is one of the main issues I've had with this yard. I'm successful with that now, and my next goal is to get some of the old world blue stems out of here. I do have some Cytotes graham in here, but there still is quite a bit of King Ranch blue stem. So another little portion of the yard, I have some Texas milkweed. This is a shady portion underneath some of the oaks, and I established this area, planted some Greg's Mist flower, which you can see in the foreground, some Texas lantana, and also got some Texas milkweed. I believe that was from one of the native plant sales also. And this area is doing very well. I see butterflies out there from time to time, not a great deal. However, once they find the Greg's Mist flower, it's usually 3 or 4. And I'm not sure, but this year, even though we had a lot of rain, my Greg's Mist flower just is not flowering as much as previous years. Maybe it's just the timing that we had so much rain early, but right now I'm only getting a couple sprouts. But I definitely want to have this little area set aside as a pollinator garden, and important thing to have, encourage everyone to do that. And I just want to point out that, there's a lot of different plants you can see here in the background. I believe there's a cedar starting over here and a twist leaf yucca. And definitely this area has evening primrose that I see a lot of sprouting and blooming in the spring. Another plant I have in my backyard is this century plant. And I got this plant from my in-laws who have a ranch out in Pipe Creek. And in the front of their ranch, they have these all over the place. So I grabbed a little 1 gallon size one and brought it home. And I planted it on the top of that berm that I spoke about earlier. And then I proceeded to ignore it and do nothing. I don't even think I watered it in. The plant has grown 3 or 4-fold now, all on its own. It loves the spot. Not only that, I have about 6 or 7 pups surrounding it. Now, I know the plants can be a little bit dangerous, and having a young son and a dog, so far it hasn't been an issue, and I don't plan on letting all the pups continue to grow to that size. But I think it's a nice plant to add a little bit of interest in one side of my yard, and especially the amount of upkeep and maintenance it takes, which is practically nothing. Definitely something to add to your yard. Zooming in a little bit on that, we can see this Green Anole. And I have these all over my yard. It's also known as the American, I can't think of the chameleon, American chameleon, because they can change color. This one's brown right now, but they change from greens to browns and even have a little bit of red under their neck. I like to think that having these around my house shows that I have a healthy ecosystem. I'm not exactly sure, but it sure does make it interesting. Oftentimes I'll go outside with my son and we'll see if we can spot an anole in one of the trees. On this slide, I'm not pointing out, once again, any one plant, but this is in the backyard on the side of the house. And I just want to point out this little planted area right in front of the air conditioning unit. Previously, all I had in it was just mulch. And all of the plants in there have come from seeds that have washed from the front yard into this area. So I have in the foreground a mountain laurel. There's some lyre-leaf sage in here. There is some horse herb. Also, I think there's even a hackberry growing back there. And this is the kind of success that I look for. I didn't do anything to establish this area. And the fact that these plants have established on their own there means that they're going to be happy there without a lot of irrigation. I'm looking forward to that mountain laurel growing a little bit higher, providing a little bit of shade and interest in that area. And this is the kind of example that I like for more of my yard to just kind of grow on its own. But that's what I'm trying to encourage other people to do too, is buy a couple plants, let them find their place in your yard, and work with them. Every once in a while I have to sprinkle some water on this area, but they're really doing this on their own. Back in the prairie area of my backyard, after a lot of those spring rains, I noticed these plants coming up. This is a Prarie Celestial. And these plants are very kind of magical. They only bloom for one day, and they do come up from a bulb. Very fragile plants, but definitely add a certain amount of interest and kind of something special. On the days when they bloom and they pop up, I run out there and try to take a picture and really enjoy that I have that kind of variety in the yard. And this picture is also from that prairie area in the backyard. This is after the rain events, also the mini rain events of the spring. This is the four-nerve daisy, and it really spread out and provided a nice prairie look and a lot of ground cover. Now, at this point right now, almost all these plants have died back. They're all brown. And which, maybe if we had a couple more rain events over the last couple months, they would have kept going. But I'm happy with that. I look at it as a success that they are reseeding from year to year. And in years where you have rain events spaced out nice and evenly, this will really contribute to that prairie area of the backyard. Another little special flower that pops up after a lot of the rain events. This is Hill Country Rain Lily, and these are from a bulb. These are all over my backyard. So after a rain event, I probably have 50 or so of these pop up. Very interesting, nice leaves also that pop up. And even after they die back a little bit, the seed head forms, and you get a nice 25 or 50 black seeds. And I just grab a handful and spread them around the yard, hoping to get more and more of these growing. I just think it adds interest and really nice to see. It'll really contribute to my prairie once it's established fully. And not only plants in the backyard, not only the dog, but also this white-lined sphinx, which forms a sphinx moth, which you can see in the lower right-hand corner. And this is a hornworm. Some people refer to them as hummingbird moth or hawk moths, but they're part of the ecosystem. And one thing I've noticed, I have found these on my tomatoes, and I have had to remove them from the tomatoes, but this one is in the back prairie area. I'm not sure what plant it's on, and hopefully I'll talk to Lee later and find that out. But I'm happy to see that they're doing well in my yard, even though I'm not letting them eat my tomatoes. This is just another little zoom in on that wire-leaf sage, and this is in the backyard also. And I highlight this one because of the beautiful bloom. I like this plant a lot, but I have trouble getting it to bloom well all the time. So it's kind of a little finicky, and I think it likes to have kind of the perfect amount of moisture and perfect amount of partial sun to get a good bloom. But this one found a place, it reseeded here on its own, and it's doing very well. Now this is a little bit different. This is not a plant. This is a cyanobacteria called nostoc, or witch's butter. And it's a bacteria that you usually don't see around your yard, but it's usually in soils. And here you can see kind of the exposed limestone in that backyard area also. So it's in a lot of the limestone on the surface, and you don't see it until it rains and swells up. Now, the first time this happened in my backyard, I noticed these piles all over the place, and I wondered what kind of animal had been in my backyard. Did a little bit of reading and was relieved to find out that it's just a cyanobacteria, not harmful at all. Just adds a little bit more interest to the backyard. And another creature found in the backyard, this is a Gulf Coast toad. And I just found this toad last week. I have, like I said, those oak trees in the backyard. And in a few of the oak trees, there's some holes. In the spring, there was a black-crested titmouse that was nesting in one of the holes. So I was curious about this other tree had a hole, and I was curious to see maybe there was a nest in it. I kind of looked down and found something staring back at me, and I was a little startled at first. Then I kind of got my camera out and zoomed in a little bit, and I had to go onto iNaturalist and find out that this was a Gulf Coast toad living in that hole in the tree right now. Probably when it rains, water gets in there and stays in there, and that toad can just live in there and maybe come out at night. Thought it was very interesting, though. And on this slide, it's very highlighting the Cydotes grama, which is this grass with these small seed heads arranged along its stem. And this is the Texas state grass. Very successful, doing well in my backyard. I did plant seed, and it does reseed on its own. And what I'm trying to do is establish this grass to kind of compete with the Old World blue stem. I think we're doing okay, and with a little bit of help from me pulling the Old World blue stem, I think I'll get more and more successful. A nice 2 to 3 foot high grass, does well, drought tolerant, and definitely appreciates it when it rains. Readily reseeds, and like I said, my philosophy of just let it go and reseed, try to control the invasives around it. I'm hoping in 5 to 10 years to have, this will be like the base of my prairie. And as we saw in the previous picture, some Texas Prickly Pear. Now this is established all over my backyard. It was there, and it did not make it through having the renters there. They had all cut it back and weed whacked it down to bare earth. But once I got in there and stopped weed whacking, it found its way back in and is reestablishing itself. This is just, you know, basically bulletproof plant. You don't have to do anything for it, and it'll do well. I do want to point out, you can even see on this one, the white waxy substance, which is from a cochineal insect scale. And if most of you don't know, if you take a little bit of that white stuff in your hand and crush it, it'll turn to this deep crimson red. And that was used by Native Americans to dye materials. So just a little bit of fun facts as we go through some of these plants. Next up, cedar elm. And this plant is in my backyard in that rocky area that's broken up by the oaks. I did purchase this cedar elm, or I think I received it at a City of San Antonio tree giveaway. It was about 2 foot tall, and I planted it in here, and I've kind of watered it in and been taking care of it. This year, I don't have to water it at all. It's established. Right now, it's about 4 foot high, and I'm establishing cedar elms back here just in case oak wilt comes through this area. I'm not close to an oak wilt area. However, I know a lot of subdivisions in northern San Antonio are affected by it. And just in case, it doesn't hurt to have some cedar elms start growing in case it goes through here. I also think this is a great tree, pretty much evergreen, very low maintenance, beautiful tree, stately, grows pretty quickly also. Definitely everyone should add one of these to their yard if they have a chance. Next up, this twist leaf yucca. This is another plant that was in the yard when I purchased the house, was mowed down, weed whacked down by renters, but then came back after that pressure was removed. We have a little stand in the backyard, and right now doesn't look so great. It's a little bit dry. I did plant the Spanish dagger over to the right. I figured, having a couple of these next to the fence provides a little bit of security. But great plants to have for your yard. If you haven't seen the plant stalk that comes up from these twist leaf yuccas, it grows up about 5-6 feet, and it eventually has a load of pale yellow flowers on it, almost so heavy that they fall over. And that doesn't kill the plant. So you can see the stalk on this one from last year. Unlike some other agaves or yuccas, when they bloom, they die. This one can rebloom. Next up, probably not a plant a lot of people would think I would put in my presentation, but this Texas Croton, it is all over my backyard right now. And I was a little bit concerned at first, but then read up on it and found that it really isn't harmful, not invasive, but it is a plant that's associated with disturbed soil. So it's probably one of the plants that is first in the progression of plants as they come in. Start off with these, and as the soil builds up, other plants will be more adapted to that site. So I'm letting these grow and seeing what happens, hoping to improve that soil in the backyard. And here is the Anolis that I spoke about earlier. I had to put it in red. I want to highlight that this is not a Texas native plant. It's an invasive plant, also known as hedge parsley, or my favorite, the tall sock destroyer. These little flowers are beautiful, and a lot of native bees and pollinators use these flowers. However, once they go to seed, these small seeds are like Velcro and stick to everything, including your pets, your pants, your socks, and that spreads the seeds all over your yard, making it even worse. So this is public plant enemy number 1 in my yard. 10,000 removed just this year. And I still patrol. I did find one plant yesterday out there and removed it. But I hope that this may be, well, I doubt it's the last year, but I hope that this is the beginning of the end of this plant in my yard. That concludes my presentation. I just want to go ahead and thank everyone for listening and for your attention. And at this point, I'm able to answer some questions.
Yes, Jake, I've got some questions ready for you.
Okay.
Okay, so Esperanza wanted to know if you have deer in your neighborhood.
Yes, we do have deer in the neighborhood, but they can only access the front yard. The backyard's all fenced in, and I don't have any plants in my front yard that I have trouble with. A lot of these plants, just the deer stay away from. Now, I know I've heard if they're hungry enough, they'll eat anything. But thankfully, I've got a lot of neighbors that believe in the magic of the English garden. And they got beautiful lawns and beautiful sago palms. They've got, those deer have so much other things to eat rather than my plants. So yeah, I don't have any pressure at all, really.
Okay, and we have a question from Judith. Is inland sea oats deer resistant?
In my yard, it is. I have not had any problems with it at all. The only plant that, there's a couple plants that in my front yard, the deer do browse from time to time. They do like the flowers and the fresh stalks off of the red yucca. And if they can get in there and get one of those fresh stalks, they will tear it and eat it down. I also planted some aloe in the front yard that my wife got, and they seem to like the aloe. I'm not sure why about that, but those are really the only 2 plants that the deer eat in my yard.
Jake, since you mentioned your wife, and I don't think you mentioned what you call your landscape, and I was hoping you would let people know.
Well, I don't refer to it as this, but my wife is more of that English garden type. So she calls the yard the Garden of Whedon. So that's not popular with me, but it is funny. She's a very funny woman.
It is funny. Okay, so we have another question from Rashida. When filling areas with native plants, how much mulching is needed?
Usually what I do is add about 3 to 4 inches of hardwood mulch. And as I said earlier, I've been using the cedar mulch, but there's also, Home Depot has a cedar and a cypress mulch. And I've used both.
Okay. We have another question here from Penny, and she noticed that it looks like your neighbors enjoy the turf grass, and you've just mentioned that they tend to lean more towards the turf. And she wants to know if you've got any challenges with your neighbors because of your reseeding native plants.
I have not had any challenges whatsoever. And I think I'm very fortunate, the subdivision that I'm in, written into the CCRs is the fact that they encourage native plants. So I really have not been challenged by anyone. And even if the HOA was upset at me, I don't think they could really do anything. The other thing, though, I think that I look at is most people, if they look at it, they may say they think it looks weedy or out of control. But I try to kind of show them, like, look at these plants are growing on their own. I don't have to irrigate. They're green. They're covering the ground. They're not weeds. And I try to educate them and go through that. And then we start talking about water bills. And I have a water bill under $100 a month, well under 100. And most of them have multi-$100 water bills, mostly due to watering their lawn.
Wow, that's amazing. And you said an acronym that I'm not familiar with. I think you said CCR?
Oh, it's covenants and something restrictions. It's the rules of the HOA.
Gotcha, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a question from Doran. And she's wondering if you know whether there's been any research on how long Cooperla seeds can remain dormant and viable in the seed bank.
Well, my research would be so far 4 years. I have basically removed as much as I could every year. This year, I know I got every plant out. But when I see 10,000 popped up this year, those have had to have been in the ground for at least 4 or 5 years. I have not done other research than that, though, other than I have done my research, and everything I read, some people say, oh, it's not a very invasive plant, it's not so harmful. The fact is, though, that it reseeds so easily and attaches and gets transported is the problem. And it pops up early, too. So when it's up, it's taking nutrients and water that other native plants could be using.
Okay, we've got a question from Judith. Is there an easy way to remove the pups of your century plant?
I think number one, don't let them get too big. Right now, most of mine are under a foot in diameter. So I could just come in with a spade and kind of get them and get their taproot and get them out of there. But I think once they get larger than that, then you really have to be careful. If you really want to remove that pup and not get hurt, trim off all the little spikes first. And then if you have to, take off one arm at a time.
Okay, we had a couple of people really like Weesatch, and Patty mentioned that it is a warbler magnet during migration. So you may decide you might want to keep your Weesatch after all.
I may decide that, and it is right in the middle of the yard, but leads me to believe maybe there is a crack in the limestone there. So that might not be a bad idea. I haven't taken it out yet, so anything could happen.
Okay, and then you showed that hawk moth, and I'm not positive, but I think that plant might have been deer vetch that it was on. There might be others on here that know better than me, but that's what it looked like to me.
I was trying to research it, and it did come up as a vetch, but I couldn't find out which one. So
yes, I think you have to talk to someone much more knowledgeable than me to differentiate.
And is that's a native plant then?
That one is, yes.
Okay,
there
good.
are a number of them. We also had a comment from Duran that the species of hornworm that was on your tomatoes might be something different. So you might actually have more than one type of a hornworm moth in your yard.
That's true. I do think the ones are different on the tomatoes because they don't have so much of the orangish colors. They really have a lot more green and blend in much better on the tomato plants. Unfortunately, I did have some visitors this year,
So we have, and I hope I say this name close to being right, Shasta wants to know, do we need to water native plants in winter and fall at all, or will they survive on their own?
My experience is even in the fall, winter, I still go out and once a month give a little bit of water. I'm not sure what the correct answer to that is, but if they're still growing and have some kind of green on them, then I give them a little bit of water. A lot of these ones, though, die back. For example, the mealy blue sage can die back almost all the way. We're looking at the Turk's cap, it can die back all the way. And at that point, if it dies back or you cut it back, then you don't need to water it.
Thank you. Rachel wants to know if any of your neighbors have been inspired to convert their lawn to something more natural.
Nobody has converted their lawn yet, but a couple of neighbors, one neighbor right next door, they did hire a landscape company to come in. They took out a little bit of lawn and they planted some mealy blue sage. They had, I think, one of the what was it? Then they had some other, a lily of the Nile put in with that too, so that doesn't count. But I am happy to see they did put some mealy blue sage.
Okay. We've got someone wondering, and I apologize, I don't know how to say your name. It's spelled Rocio. And they want to know if you have a recommendation for a good evergreen shrub for the shade.
Evergreen shrub for the shade.
And while you're thinking, I'll just let you know if there's a good comment.
Did they say what size? And maybe I'll ask you too, Lee. One shrub that I am thinking about purchasing is wax myrtle. And I'm not sure if it'll do so great in the shade. Is it kind of full sun, partial sun?
Oh, well, now you're going to put me on the spot. So wax myrtle is a good one that takes shade, as far as I know. But I don't have any in my own yard, and I don't have a lot of hands-on experience, but it is a great one. It does do in the shade. Another good one, which you do have in your yard, is agarita. And that's
it's not a very friendly shrub, but yeah, it is a nice little shrub.
Yes, and so that might be another option, and just depending on where they are, maybe at one of the evergreen sumacs or something like that.
Yeah.
So we've got some other questions. We've had a lot of comments, Jake, about people really liking your yard and wanting to do something too. And there's another question here from Julie, and she says, I have a full shade area next to my house. Are there any native plants you would recommend to fill that space?
This slide right here is a perfect example. It's, it has that cedar sage. This is full shade right here. It's under some oak trees right next to the house. There's Turk's cap, cedar sage, lyre-leaf sage, the Salvia gregii or autumn sage. Also, I have that the fish on a line. There's what else is in there? There's a mountain laurel in there. Even though it's very shady, the mountain laurel is doing great. So when things establish on their own, they find their own little place. They'll even mountain laurel do well in the shade. There's also some yellow bells in there growing in the shade. So I think this slide has a lot of those plants that'll do well.
And I think I see some smilax, some greenbrier that you're letting grow.
Oh, yeah.
Some native vines grow up your trees.
I can cut those back every year, and they still find a way to climb up the tree the next year.
Well, you can eat the fresh growth of the tips. They're actually quite tasty raw.
Oh.
Let's see. So we have another question. Another person, I apologize. I'm horrible with names. Talat. And they want to know, what does your yard look like in other seasons like winter?
In winter, there are some plants that kind of die back. So it is a little bit more barren. Definitely this area in the shade is a little more barren. The Turk's cap often dies back. The Salvia gregii or the autumn sage dies back. Sometimes though, this cedar sage stays green throughout the winter. It just depends on how cold it gets. But so yeah, there are some things that get brown or die back. And that's just, I think for me, it's one of the things, it's part of the season, and doesn't bother me too much, but I can see how some people might say, oh, that looks horrible. I couldn't put up with that.
Okay, so we have from Fred. Fred says, speaking of weeds, what about the bed straw Klinger's weed in the spring, or is that not a North San Antonio problem? Do you know the plant he's talking about, bed straw?
No, not by that name, but
Sticky Willie?
Pardon me?
Sticky Willie is another name.
I'm not familiar with that one.
And cleavers, and it does stick. Yes, it sticks all over you. I think if you had it, you would probably know that you had it.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know whether it's just if it's not a North San Antonio problem. I have it at kind of 1604-281 area, and I like it, and I let it grow in certain spots, not everywhere, but. And so we have another question this one's from Esperanza, and my Turk's cap is really spindly. Do you think that cutting it back could help it become fuller?
I do think so. Probably in the late fall, I would do something like that. You know, in most cases, when the Turk's cap gets a little spindly, it may need a little bit of water, or maybe waiting until the fall and cutting it back and letting it kind of save up some energy over the winter and come back will help too. And it may just be not a good location for it.
Okay, so we have Rebecca wants to know, will you be putting in pathways, like hardscape type pathways, in order to wander through the backyard and look at the plants?
I have some long-term plans for the backyard, and I have to compromise with my wife, who would like to just mow the whole thing and put a lawn in. So yeah, I'll probably be putting in some naturalized pathways, maybe paver stones. But I do want that back prairie area to have some kind of use, meaning I might establish a turf area that with a border around it, or some kind of shade structure. And at that point, have some points of interest back there. But I do think I will have some kind of way to walk around. Right now, it's not easy to walk around because there's still a lot of plants that have something that's going to stick you. And I don't know if other people have, I have a lot of that little mite in my backyard and end up getting little bites from it. And this is, 5 or 6 years after having deer back there, there's still those little mites back there. And that makes it difficult. I really have to kind of put on a lot of pesticides and stuff on my legs if I go back there a lot.
Okay, Candy wants to know, do you have blooming plants throughout the year?
Yeah, there is always something blooming here. A lot of times, even right now, I go out, my mealy blue sage, I kind of water it a little bit every week, but I still have some blooms right now. My red yucca still has some blooms right now. So yeah, the yellow bells. I also, there's a lot of other plants I didn't point out. I have some rock rose that's blooming. So even right now in the heat of summer, there are things blooming.
That's awesome. I am not finding any additional questions in the chat right now, but I was informed by somebody that they sent you a private chat, and I might, private chat, I might have gotten that question. It was about the evergreen shrub in the shade possibly, but if you could just check real quick to see if anyone else happened to send you any
I don't see anything. Not really sure how I would it pop up?
Okay.
I don't see anything.
Yes, it would just pop up in the chat window and you would be able to see it. But thank you so much, Jake. Your yard is awesome, and I knew it was going to be fun to see it again. And I know there's lots of comments from people who were inspired by what you're doing here. And so I think it is, unless there's anything more you wanted to say, Jake, we were going to give everybody the opportunity to turn on their cameras. But is there anything else you'd like to say before we do that?
I would just like to thank everyone for their attention and really encourage them attend the native plant sale and start exploring and experimenting in your yard.
Okay, we got one question that just popped in.
Okay.
Don't start bombarding us with questions, you guys. You mentioned the San Antonio tree giveaway. Who sponsors that?
That was by the city of San Antonio. I'm pretty sure they do that twice a year.
And if you stop sharing your screen, Jake, I think people can put put on the gallery view. And if you want to, go ahead and turn on your camera so we can see your smiling faces before we close down the meeting for the night. Thanks, everybody, for coming. We had 100 people, and we did not expect 100 people. And so we're going to probably be looking into getting the ability to allow more than 100 people, because there were some folks that wanted to get in and they couldn't get in. And we just really didn't expect that. So it's really exciting that so many people were interested in coming in, and thanks y'all so much. I see some friendly faces. Nice to see you guys. I think you have to scroll. If you want to see everybody, you have to scroll through some panels. I see a lot of people I haven't seen in a long time and some new faces. That's awesome. Well, I hope everybody takes care. And if you're interested in those native landscape certification program classes, fall classes, registration opens tomorrow, and we tend to have those fill up really quick. Because they're going to be online, we have increased the amount of people that can attend. But if you're interested, I would recommend going tomorrow. So Joan, anything from you before we close down and say goodnight? No? Joan says no.
Nope, I'm going to go ahead. It's great to see everyone, and I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting and hope to see you next month. Should be a good program. So thanks. Great to see you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.